In a blistering address delivered before the John M. Ashbrook Memorial Dinner in Ashland, Ohio, in May 1983, President Ronald Reagan, then halfway through his first term in office, condemned the Great Society as a bundle of expensive and failed initiatives that increased, rather than lightened, the burden of poverty for tens of millions of American citizens. The vast expansion of the federal state that marked the 5-year tenure of his predecessor Lyndon B. Johnson had only reinforced the central political error of our time, Reagan warned, the flawed notion that government and bureaucracy were the primary vehicle of social change. For Reagan, the historical syllogism was simple. The Great Society coincided with an end to economic progress for America's poor people. Thus, the Great Society was responsible for the wage stagnation and rising income inequality of the 1970s that effectively marked the end of the post-war economic boom. Reagan gave voice to an emerging consensus among movement conservatives that the Great Society had immiserated the very people it intended to help. In the decades following his speech, leaders on the right drew this theme out, arguing not only that the Great Society hobbled the American economy, but also that it perpetuated a debilitating culture of dependency among its beneficiaries, thereby wrecking families and communities, as Wisconsin Congressman and vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan claimed in 2012. So, did the Great Society fail? The short answer is no. Conservative fault-finders tend to cherry-pick those pieces of Johnson's legacy that seem not to have worked, notably the War on Poverty's community action programs and experiments in public housing, and ignore programs now inextricably woven into the fabric of American civic and economic life. These critics ignore the many lasting successes of the Great Society because, a half-century after the fact, it is all but impossible to conceive of a United States without Medicare and Medicaid, public television, integrated hotels and restaurants and polling places, federal aid to primary and secondary schools, or federally guaranteed college loans, programs that continue to command wide backing. Some of this selectivity owes to confusion over what exactly the Great Society actually was. Like Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, it was an elastic term that accommodated a broad range of sometimes divergent ideas and programs. Should it include the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act? The War on Poverty? And if so, which specific programs under that broad umbrella? Federal aid to schools and universities? Hospital insurance for the elderly? Because of this definitional challenge, it is all too easy for both defenders and critics to fasten on to what they love or abhor about the Great Society and leave the rest unaccounted for. But the conservative argument with the Great Society is about far more than the value of particular domestic policies and programs. It's a debate over the very role of government. In short, is big government the solution to systemic economic and social problems, or the cause? If we are to use the Great Society as a litmus test for the argument against big government, it's critical to assess whether the Great Society succeeded on its own terms, to consider the context in which LBJ's administration labored, the ideas that guided it, the political circumstances that constrained it, the problems that it set out to solve, and the shifting economic reality that in later years forced the Great Society to compensate for challenges its architects never anticipated. Judged by those standards, the Great Society proved a successful and lasting experiment. In the bleakest days of the Great Depression, consensus emerged among liberal policymakers that capitalism was irrevocably broken. Economist Alvin Hansen warned in 1938 of a future marked by sick recoveries which die in their infancy and depressions which feed on themselves and lead a hard and seemingly immovable core of unemployment. But the experience of World War II and the early Cold War era altered this bleak thinking as the United States experienced a period of record economic expansion, driving a transition for millions of Americans from renter to homeowner, blue-collar worker to white-collar worker, and a world of Depression-era scarcity and wartime rationing to post-war consumer plenty. The success of the federal state in mobilizing for World War II convinced many post-war liberals that through a deliberate application of Keynesian measures, policy experts could calibrate government spending to ensure sustained growth, full employment, and low inflation, in perpetuity. This point, in turn, led many Democrats to rethink their long-standing ideas about the nature of inequality. A generation ago, it would have been taken for granted that a war on poverty meant taxing money away from the haves and turning it over to the have-nots, observed the journalist Walter Lippmann. But in this generation, a revolutionary idea has taken hold. The size of the pie can be increased by invention, organization, capital investment and fiscal policy, and then a whole society, not just one part of it, will grow richer. Some voices in the administration argued that what poor people needed most was income, which the government could furnish through public sector relief jobs reminiscent of the New Deal. Prominent figures on the left, including the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal, the socialist writer Michael Harrington, Todd Gitlin and Tom Hayden, founders of Students for a Democratic Society, Irving Howe, the editor of Dissent magazine, and Stuart Meacham of the American Friends Service Committee, concurred, calling for an incomes policy that would furnish every family with an adequate income as a matter of right. It was the only way, they believed, by which the quarter of the nation now dispossessed and soon to be dispossessed by lack of employment can be brought within the abundant society. But most liberal policymakers disagreed. The economy, after all, was humming. Those who had been left behind, whether because of cultural deprivation or geography, only needed to be equipped with the means to claim their fair share of an ever-growing pie. The president also agreed. Early in his administration, when Labor Secretary Willard Wirtz proposed a New Deal-style public works program, LBJ responded with an absolute blank stare, a participant in the meeting recalled. Instead, LBJ and his administration advanced a series of qualitative measures aimed at empowering poor and vulnerable people to lift themselves out of poverty, while helping those who could not work, the elderly, disabled, and, so the thinking went, single mothers, enjoy a more comfortable and dignified life. Some of these programs, like federal aid to primary and secondary education and government health insurance for senior citizens, had been bedrock liberal aspirations dating back at least 20 years. Others, like job training and nutrition assistance, began as pilot initiatives during JFK's presidency. Still others were products of their time. Community action programs intended to help poor and politically marginalized citizens organize and advocate for better services in their own neighborhoods. Head Start, to furnish poor children with pre-K classes and medical and nutritional assistance. A Job Corps for young men in rural and urban areas, and free legal aid for the poor. What joined these diverse programs into a coherent idea was the belief that disadvantaged people needed qualitative help in tapping their share of opportunity, not income assistance. To be sure, not everyone bought into the logic behind growth liberalism or opportunity theory. By 1965, Sargent Shriver, LBJ's poverty czar, and a one-time proponent of qualitative measures to fight inequality, believed that to end poverty in the United States as we know it today within a generation, the administration ought to adopt a negative income tax. Qualitative measures would not suffice. The concept had bipartisan draw. As president, Richard Nixon proposed substituting cash assistance for social services. But layering a minimum income on top of existing anti-poverty programs would cost at least $7.5 billion in incremental spending. It was a political non-starter, particularly as the Vietnam War bloated the federal budget and threatened to inflate the economy at dangerous levels. And for most Great Society architects, income redistribution, even if politically feasible, was a solution better suited to a stagnant economy, not a growing one. The same worldview influenced the administration's decision to walk back long-standing aspirations to build a government-run healthcare system for all Americans, a liberal hope since as early as 1934. Throughout the 1940s, dogged opposition from the American Medical Association, AMA, and congressional Republicans stymied progressive efforts to make this dream a reality. But the problem wasn't just conservative opposition to socialist medicine. By the 1960s, many Democrats no longer believed that universal government health care was necessary. After World War II, major employers began extending new benefits to workers, including paid vacations, annual cost of living adjustments to wages, and defined benefits pensions. By 1960, 100 million Americans enjoyed access to private health plans. What many liberals once assumed that government would need to do for working-class citizens, private industry now offered on a contingent basis. Many people, including many African Americans, Latinos, and unmarried women, most non-unionized workers, the unemployed, and children of uninsured adults, did not enjoy access to such benefits. But Democrats turned their focus to a narrower subset of the population that, by definition, could not access employer-based health programs. Senior citizens, most of whom were no longer in the workforce, and indigent people of all ages, many of whom were expected to be either widows or disabled people no longer able to work. It made enough sense in its own time. What LBJ and his supporters did not anticipate was that by the early 1970s, the era of boundless growth, of low inflation, broadly distributed incomes, and a growing unionized workforce enjoying strong wages and stable benefits would grind to a screeching halt. If Great Society liberals failed to anticipate an end to post-war economic expansion, their eyes were wider open to systemic racism, which made a mockery of opportunity theory. All the education and training in the world would not help a citizen who was artificially barred from participating fully in housing or labor markets. Dismantling Jim Crow became fundamental to the liberal project and a central current that ran throughout most of the Great Society's key initiatives. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 famously mandated the desegregation of places of public accommodation. Equally important, Title VI of the bill also empowered the government to withhold federal funds from state and local authorities that failed to comply with the law. In the early months of Medicare's existence in 1966, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HUE, sent more than 1,000 inspectors to ensure that Southern nursing homes and hospitals had desegregated their facilities. More than 12,000 facilities swiftly acquiesced. The federal guidelines were sweeping. To be eligible for Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements, nursing homes and hospitals were compelled to admit people regardless of color, race, or national origin. Where there was a significant variation between the racial composition of patients and the population served, the facility had an affirmative obligation to justify that discrepancy to HUE. Each facility's rooms, wards, floors, sections, and buildings were to be integrated. Officials were not permitted to ask if patients preferred to share quarters with someone of a particular race. Employees, medical staff, and volunteers of the hospital are to be assigned to patient service on a colorblind basis, the rules continued. Hospital and nursing home employees would be required to use courtesy titles such as Dr., Mrs., and Mr., without regard to race. And formerly segregated institutions were required to conduct proactive outreach to non-white physicians, nurses, and civil rights organizations, and take out advertisements and local media outlets announcing the change in their policy. The administration also used Title VI to cajole local schools into desegregating. Districts were required to submit desegregation plans and demonstrate progress in meeting them. Much of the onus for compelling compliance fell on Francis Keppel, the administration's chief SOB with the Southerners, who regularly reviewed district-level desegregation plans with LBJ's domestic policy aide, Joe Califano. During these meetings in the West Wing, the president would routinely wander in and out saying, "Get 'em, get 'em, get the last ones." Debates over what constituted desegregation and whether the standard should be desegregation or integration persisted into the 1970s and beyond. Court-imposed busing plans would overtake Title VI compliance as a political lightning rod after Johnson left office. But the combination of administrative and judicial firepower ultimately worked. From 1965 to 1968, the number of black students in the South who attended majority white schools rose from roughly 2.3% to almost 23.4%. That ratio would continue to climb over the following 2 decades until it peaked at 43.5% in 1988. Further, from 1968 to 1980, the portion of Southern black children attending deeply segregated schools where they made up over 90% of the student population, fell from 77.5% to 26.5%. In those same years, the portion of white Southern students attending deeply segregated public schools dropped from 68.8% to 26%. The administration also moved quickly to force compliance with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 4 days after the bill signing ceremony, federal examiners arrived in 12 counties in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia to assume control of enrollment. By the following January, they added over 90,000 voters to the rolls in those jurisdictions alone. Violence and intimidation persisted, but for the most part, Southern authorities acquiesced in the face of strong executive enforcement. As late as 1965, only 6.7% of African Americans in Mississippi and 19% in Alabama had surmounted the complex of legal and extra-legal measures in place to prevent them from exercising the franchise. By 1970, roughly 2/3 of African Americans in these Deep South states were registered to vote, and most were able to exercise this right without interference. The Great Society did not eliminate systemic racism, far from it. But the gulf between the world as it existed in 1960 and as it exists today is wide, in no small part because Lyndon Johnson committed to spending down much of his political capital on civil rights. The Great Society was predicated on the belief that America would long enjoy sustained economic growth, low inflation, and strong wages and benefits for a growing portion of its population. But the subsequent history speaks for itself. Owing in part to the runaway spending on the Vietnam War, as well as a series of supply shocks in the food and energy sectors, Americans absorbed over a decade of runaway inflation. Inflation was accompanied by rising unemployment, particularly in the manufacturing sector, which for many years had formed the backbone of America's prosperous post-war middle class. Stagflation, the combination of high unemployment and inflation, undermined the concept of opportunity theory. Experts had lost control of the economic levers, and increasingly it became clear that all the education and training in the world would not help poor people in urban ghettos, declining coal towns in Appalachia, or mid-sized cities in western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, where in the coming decade, empty steel mills stood as skeletal reminders of the country's bygone industrial might. Poor people needed income, not qualitative assistance, to capture their share of a shrinking pie. During the Kennedy and Johnson years, the American economy expanded at an average annual rate of 4.6% each year. The country has not seen growth like that since. To be sure, America has experienced periods of sustained economic expansion since the 1960s. But in recent decades, the blessings of limited economic growth have accrued principally to the wealthiest Americans. When Lyndon Johnson left office in 1969, the poorest quintile of American households earned 4.1% of the nation's aggregate income, and the richest quintile took home 43%. By 2010, the bottom quintile saw its share of income drop to just 3.1%, while the top quintile saw its share rise to 51.9%. Stagnant incomes are central to this story. Between World War II and 1973, real wages grew steadily at a rate of between 2% and 3% each year, enabling millions of American workers to enjoy upward mobility. Then wage growth slowed dramatically for many Americans. Over the next 3 decades, household wages remained essentially flat, principally because more women entered the workforce even as men's wages fell in real dollar terms. In the main, families with 2 wage earners were able to keep their heads above water and maintain what they had. Families headed by single parents fell behind as wage growth stalled. These economic trends also strained the New Deal/Great Society safety net. Programs like Medicaid and SNAP, originally known as food stamps, were initially designed to help a small subset of poor people, particularly single mothers and their children or disabled workers, escape the grind of hunger and sickness. But by 2021, some 51% of Black children, 29% of Latino children, and 22% of white children resided in single-parent households. Given the stagnation of wages since 1973, single-parent families are more likely to be poor. At the same time, record-setting numbers of working-age adults have slipped out of the workforce. They are neither employed nor seeking employment, and many have filed for permanent disability benefits, a trend that has alarmed conservatives and liberals alike. In the 50 years since LBJ's presidency, the social contract between employers and employees has broken down considerably, driven in large part by the sharp decline of private sector unions. Great Society programs had to work harder for more people than they were originally intended to help. As more families fell below the poverty line, Medicaid, SNAP, and general anti-poverty programming have had to cover a larger body of constituents. The result has been a steady expansion of programs that were initially intended to plug holes in the dam, not constitute the dam itself. Great Society programs such as SNAP, which covered 500,000 recipients in 1965 but roughly 40 million in 2020, and free or subsidized school meals, a product of the 1966 Child Nutrition Act, whose enrollment grew from 22.5 million in 1970 to 29.4 million in 2019, have evolved into a hidden form of income support. The same is true of Medicaid, CHIP, and Medicare, which cover 147 million Americans, roughly 45% of all the country's population. Because these benefits qualify in budgetary terms as a near-cash benefit, meaning that they are not technically income, the federal government does not include their value when measuring poverty. Using the alternative Supplementary Poverty Measure, SPM, which counts the value of such benefits as part of household income, census figures in 2010 revealed that food stamps cut the child poverty rate by 3 percentage points. Taken in sum, non-cash benefits associated with LBJ's domestic initiatives cut the poverty rate by 26% between 1960 and 2010, with 2/3 of the decline occurring before 1980. Ronald Reagan famously quipped that Lyndon Johnson declared war on poverty and poverty won. Yet, even without accounting for near-cash assistance, the national poverty rate declined from 20% to 12% under LBJ's watch. By contrast, it stood at 13% when Reagan was elected president, and it remained at 13% when he left office. The poverty rate among African Americans was roughly 55% in 1959. It dropped to 32% by 1969 when LBJ left office, and stood at 23% in 2020. Among people of all races living in households led by single mothers, the poverty rate dropped from 49% in 1959 to 38% in 1969. It stood at 26% in 2020. None of this is to say Johnson bears sole credit for sharp reductions in poverty over the past 50 years, although the Great Society's civil rights legislation surely helped erode racial and gender disparities in employment and housing. Even so, the trend line refutes the claim that poverty won the war. In other fundamental ways, the Great Society has proven a lasting success. Although entire libraries could be shelved with debates over the correlation, or lack thereof, between education expenditures and educational achievement, federal funding for K-12 education undeniably closed yawning gaps between wealthier and poorer regions and addressed a clear deficiency in resources that states would otherwise have been ill-equipped to remedy. Between 1958 and 1968, federal spending on primary and secondary education rose from less than 3% to more than 10% of total education funding. As LBJ himself predicted, once formalized as policy, it grew. By 1985, the federal government's share of all K-12 school spending rose to 16%. The percentage provided by state governments rose from 41% to 55%, and the portions shouldered by local governments fell from 51% to 31%. Because many local and state governments rely heavily on regressive property and sales taxes, in many cases these swings shifted some of the burden for funding schools from working class and poor families to middle class and wealthy taxpayers. In the early 1970s, Congress plugged some of the loopholes in the program by imposing maintenance of effort, MOE, requirements on states and localities. To continue receiving funds, they had to set their own education budgets at a high fraction of the prior year's appropriation, thus ensuring that federal dollars truly were supplementary. As the federal government gradually imposed additional restrictions governing the allocation of federal education funds, state authorities centralized and professionalized their education departments and school systems to ensure ease of compliance and the continued flow of federal dollars. In this way, too, the Great Society proved not just a funding source, but also an engine of reform and modernization. 50 years after the fact, liberals are looking for ways to supplement and surpass the Great Society. Some are revisiting ideas that Johnson's White House considered but ultimately rejected, like a guaranteed basic family income. In her campaign memoir, Hillary Clinton revealed that in 2016 she came very close to proposing such a policy. Even as this book goes to print, Joe Biden's administration has quietly rolled out means-tested child tax credits. They came in the form of monthly cash transfers deposited directly into people's bank accounts and entitled families to $3,000 in annual payments per child, $3,600 for children under 6 years old. Estimates suggest that this program, which Congress allowed to sunset after Biden's first year in office, temporarily cut the child poverty rate in half overnight. It remains to be seen whether the program will be renewed in some form. The Biden administration also summarily recalibrated the government's SNAP payment tables to increase household food assistance by an average of 25% each month, the largest expansion of Johnson's food stamp program since its inception. The Great Society was a creature of its time. It succeeded in many of the things it set out to do. It also formed a critical safety net as American society changed in ways that few people could have anticipated in LBJ's time. Alone, the safety net may no longer be enough to ensure that all Americans enjoy basic economic security, and with it, food and health security. But when critics home in on its alleged failures, they more generally hope to establish a case against government intervention in the economy. That case falls apart on reconsideration of the Great Society's many achievements. Hours after ascending to the presidency, Johnson marveled that Every issue that is on my desk tonight was on my desk when I came to Congress in 1937. Civil rights, health insurance for the elderly and poor, federal aid to primary and secondary education, support for higher education, anti-poverty and nutritional programs. It has now been a half-century since LBJ addressed those challenges. He did so while operating in a specific time and context. Today, the same challenges are as urgent as ever before, even as the context is starkly different.